Back in June, Grant announced the Summer Mathematics Exposition 2 contest. I participated last year, but I feel like I missed the mark. So this year, I've been training intensely, and I am going to win. Okay, this isn't about winning, it's about making good mathematics content. So I'm gonna make good mathematics content, or at least I'm gonna try. So what I need to do is I need to come up with an idea. So I was sitting on the couch, sipping my morning coffee, vibing with my 2 children. And for some reason, I couldn't hear myself think. And then it hit me. There are voices in my head that I can't hear. And not because my children are screaming. When I was a kid, I often wondered how I could be sitting down watching the death of Optimus Prime while someone else is watching Littlefoot's mother die, while yet another was watching Atreyu lose his horse. Man, it was hard being a kid in the 80s. But how can we be watching all these same things broadcast at the same time? We also have emergency dispatchers communicating through radio, country music stations, talk shows, children fighting a demogorgon, the morning news, and today, we have Wi-Fi and cell phone signals. We exist in a soup of information literally floating in the air. All you need is just the right tool to extract the signal that you want. What's really incredible is that there are all kinds of different ways used to send these signals. Some are digital, while others are completely analog. But what do I know about radio signals? I'm a mathematician. I could tell you something about AM radio and how Fourier series play a role, and I will. But if I really want to drive the point home, then I need to do something a bit more hands-on. I am going to do the impossible for a mathematician. I am going to build a radio. I honestly have no idea how to do that, but I remember my dad telling me about the Tandy Radio Shack Science Fair kit with 150 experiments that he played with as a teenager. It had all sorts of instructions that were so good that even a child could make a radio with it.
We're at a place where the mind can comprehend and devise a solar radio. 65 electronic projects brought to reality with this science fair kit. But you can find it for Christmas in a place that's known as Radio Shack.
So now, I know what I need to do. I need to find a Radio Shack. Everything obviously can't just play all at once. And so somehow, we want to shift our signals out of the way from each other. One obvious way of doing this is to make a schedule. Transformers can play from 1 to 1:30. Country music can play a song at 1:45. Emergency dispatch can take calls from 2 to 4. I can call my mom at 4:30, and those kids in Hawkins, Indiana have to restrict their upside down business from 5 to 6, because otherwise, we might all miss Dr. Phil. It's probably obvious to you that this isn't how things are handled. We can't just schedule the whole world's transmissions to happen one at a time. So we don't shift in time, we shift in frequency. It turns out that we can express a signal as a sum of sinusoids. This is called a Fourier series. Each sinusoid contributes its amplitudes to what we call the spectrum of the signal. Grant has a bunch of videos on that topic, and honestly, so do I. And for each sinusoid, there are 2 contributions, which correspond to the representation of a sinusoid as a sum of 2 complex exponentials. Here's an example of a signal and its spectrum.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
What we'll do is we'll shift this spectrum away from the center and claim some patch of the frequency domain as our own. We do this by multiplying by a carrier wave. This has its own expression in terms of exponentials, and if we remember our Fourier theory, multiplication by a complex exponential shifts the spectrum by the frequency in the exponential. So each exponential shifts in opposite directions, and we see that we get 2 copies of our signal when we add those 2 together. Increase the frequency of the carrier wave enough, and bam, we are all alone in the spectral world. What is incredible is how easy it is to get our signal back. First of all, just look at this. With a really high frequency carrier wave, you can see your signal hanging out at the peaks of the modulated carrier wave. Well, almost. If your signal is ever 0, then it's harder to see. One way to fix this is to add an extra carrier wave at a really high amplitude to push away from the zeros. And now you can see it. The signal we are sending is often called our message signal, and the peaks of our modulated carrier wave form our message when you look at the envelope surrounding them. Adding an additional carrier wave gives us a double sideband large carrier amplitude modulation. This is DSBLC. This is what is typically done in radio because the corresponding receivers are cheap and easy to make. When people say amplitude modulation without qualification, they mean DSBLC. Mathematically, getting our signal back just comes down to multiplying by the carrier wave again. This gives us 2 copies of the 2 copies, except now we have 2 of the 4 copies overlapping. This means that we are boosting the signal that we want, and we have 2 additional copies out there in Signal Never Neverland, and possibly beyond human hearing. If you do still hear those other copies, we can use a low-pass filter to kill it off. In practice, most reasonable devices act as a low-pass filter anyway. Electronically, we're going to need to make what is called an envelope detector, which is a really easy circuit with 3 components and a few wires. Radio Shack was a magical place for computer lovers and electronics. They were the best buy of the 1980s, where you could buy all sorts of electronics, computers, video games, and even learn how to make electronics yourself. They even had their own repair center, a bit like the Geek Squad.
Dad, I really like this electronic project kit.
I have to say, they aren't looking so hot these days. So I've been looking at a lot of these old Radio Shack sites, and they've all been replaced with either, say, batteries and bulbs or some other thing. Best you can find at the very moment is a Radio Shack Express, which can be found in places like Hobbytown and things like that. But that's not really a full Radio Shack like it used to be. I think we're gonna have to take another route, and I think we're gonna have to see if we can find the Tandy Radio Shack Science Fair kit with 150 experiments online. AM radio is the earliest version of radio transmission and modulation. You can see how simple the design of the modulating circuit is in, say, US patent number 706747 by Reginald A. Fessenden. This was patented in 1902, which was done while Fessenden was working for the US Weather Bureau. In 1906, Fessenden made history by transmitting the first radio broadcast from Brant Rock Station on Christmas, where he played O Holy Night on his violin and read a Bible passage. Unfortunately, AM is subjected to a lot of natural interference and political intrigue. Lots of forces can introduce noise in an AM signal, such as lightning, your vacuum cleaner, a train passing by, and now cell and Wi-Fi signals. Even so, AM radio brought news and entertainment from around the world at the speed of light to living rooms everywhere from about the 1930s and lasting to today. RCA radio constituted a huge portion of the market at the time.
Looks like a suitcase. It's a 1925 RCA portable radio. RCA Victor, world leader in radio.
And RCA had a ton of AM-related patents. And when Edwin Armstrong came around and wrote a paper introducing frequency modulation, they weren't too happy. RCA CEO David Sarnoff tried really hard to kill FM radio. And he even went as far as convincing the FCC that the 88 to 108 MHz band would be better than the 40 to 50 MHz band, which many of the investors of FM favored. Sarnoff hoped that the additional power would be too costly and that FM would die. It was later discovered that the propagation characteristics for FM was better in that band, and there was more room for more stations. This was bad news for Sarnoff and RCA. This wasn't the end of AM radio, however, and it is still used frequently today. Those old RCA setups would still be able to listen to a good amount of radio traffic in 2022. However, the bandwidth allowed for AM stations has been rather restricted by the National Radio Standards Committee. A human can hear signals anywhere from 20 Hz to 20 kHz when they're young. As you age, your hearing becomes less and less sensitive, and the upper bound of your hearing range will decrease to about 10 kHz. Ever try a hearing test side by side with a kindergartner? It's really humbling. If we allowed 20 kHz transmissions using DSBLC, then we need a bandwidth of 40 kHz to transmit that full signal, because we're using each sideband surrounding our carrier frequency. In 1990, the NRSC wanted to increase the number of AM stations by reducing the amount of allowed bandwidth that each station was allowed to use. They restricted the highest frequency to 7.5 kHz, giving a bandwidth of 15 kHz. This is a good deal below what you can hear, even as an older adult. And this is why AM radio sounds like it's such low quality. All right, so it finally came in. So let's see what we got. So this is the Science Fair 150-in-1 Electronics Project Kit.
and this was from Tandy Radio Shack. This is a version I found online, and the seller said they had a few missing pieces, but he actually went through and added those back in because he really knows this kit forwards and backwards. So hopefully this has enough for us to actually make a radio. What we need is a diode, we need a capacitor, and we need a resistor, and some wires. And putting all those together, that should be enough to give us an envelope detector that we can then feed into a speaker. And this definitely has a speaker.
Okay, bad news. It's been a month since I recorded that first half of the video. It turns out that asking an electronics kit to survive and function after 40 years might be a bit much.
That's clearly broken. And it's clearly a problem with the science fair kit and nothing to do with my complete lack of ability with electronics.
I spent a good hour hooking up wires and troubleshooting, but no matter what I did, I could not get a reasonable signal out of there.
I'm not getting anything. I mean, it doesn't matter which knobs I turn. I can get anything that's louder or quieter, but no matter what I do, I don't have a decent radio signal coming out of the speaker. So
the deadline for submission is August 15th, and today is the 14th. Somehow, I have to put something together. And this means it's time to look into a modern version of the Tandy Radio Shack Science Fair kit with 150 experiments, or, well, specifically, any kit that had just one experiment, an AM radio kit. So this is the one I found. It requires a bit more skill than the Radio Shack kit, but it's still relatively straightforward. The one catch? I need to solder, which I haven't done since a long time.
3 hours later.
I ended up precariously balancing a board on a few coasters and accidentally soldering a few holes closed. That's rather embarrassing.
That even a child could make a radio with it.
At the end of the day, there's a reason I became a mathematician. So why don't we stick to the math? Let's talk about how a basic envelope detector works. We need 3 components: a diode, a resistor, and a capacitor. And if you don't know, a diode only lets a current travel in one direction. That is, it has a bias. If the current tries to go from left to right here, it will travel unimpeded. However, if the current tries to go in the other direction, then it is stopped as if there was no connection there at all. A capacitor stores a charge that matches the voltage applied to it. Then it will later release a charge when you set it up like this. And the stronger the resistance here, the slower the discharge. The discharge can be modeled as a decaying exponential, where we see the contribution of the resistor in the exponent. The bigger the resistor, the more ohms, the flatter the discharge. We can also write this as a differential equation, like so. Now, an envelope detector is set up like this. The antenna comes in through the left, and this lead is connected to the ground. The signal the antenna is receiving is then driving your voltage as compared to the ground. Think of this as a sort of electronic sail. Now, while the voltage is positive, the diode lets the current through, and our capacitor charges to reach the received voltage. Once the voltage peaks and starts to go down, the voltage across the capacitor now exceeds that of the incoming signal and tries to push back against the diode. The diode is having nothing of this and blocks the current from going in the other direction. So until the antenna voltage exceeds that of the capacitor, the circuit must act like there is nothing connected here, and the capacitor begins to discharge. So if we measure the voltage here, we see an initial increase in the voltage and then a decrease as the capacitor discharges. Now, when the voltage from the antenna gets big enough, the capacitor charges, and then we see the voltage rise. That's an envelope detector, and we make a digital model for the voltage across the capacitor x of t like so. If the voltage from the antenna is bigger than or equal to x of t, then we set x of t plus 1 to be that voltage. If the voltage at time t is smaller than x of t, then x starts to decay and we express x of t plus 1 as x of t minus x of t divided by r, which is the same as 1 minus 1 over r times x of t. Now, this digital version is a discretization, and that R is related to the resistor, but might end up being a bit scaled because of the time stepping. Now let's give this discrete version a try on a virtual AM dataset and see if we can recover our signal. We aren't going to get a perfect reconstruction here since the peaks aren't occurring at twice the frequency of the audio signal we wanted. That means that we aren't going to satisfy the Nyquist criterion for perfect reconstruction, but we will see that we can get something very passable. Here is a modulated waveform. We want to basically connect the peaks here. If we set R too low, then we end up chasing the signal too closely. If we set R to be too high, then we see that the decay isn't fast enough. In this simulation, I found about 2.5 to work out the best. Let's give it a listen. We can smooth out that high frequency bit by using a low pass filter. And this is what we get after that. Okay, now let's check back to see if I got this radio thing working. Wow! Listen to the audio on this. Who would have thought that a little radio could sound so good? Oh, you weren't supposed to see that. This is really awkward. Yeah, I couldn't get it working, and it's something I'll have to come back to some point in the future. But the point of the video was to give you the math. And I hope you liked this video, and cheers to Grant for conducting this competition. It's fun to shake things up, and I'll try to do more involved things like this in the future too. If you want to learn more math, then please subscribe. I also have a few really fun videos coming down the pipeline. Some are really light, and others are connected to my research. I am currently working through a series on elementary analysis, if you're gearing up for that class this fall, and more control theory lectures are on their way too. One way or another, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I look forward to having you here again, and until next time, I hope you have a great day.